Dear followers of the Wereldmorgen, welcome. The Wereldmorgen.be, that means the world tomorrow. That's the meaning of our website. We are an alternative news site in Belgium and the Netherlands, publishing in the Dutch language. We give a voice to the social struggle in our own country and in other countries and abroad, and we talk about issues that really matter, that according to us are not being broadcast in the right way in the mainstream media. But that's our opinion on things. Today, we have the honor of meeting the author of a very important book, Benjamin Abelow, How the West Brought War to Ukraine, Understanding How US and NATO Policies Led to Crisis, War, and the Risk of Nuclear Catastrophe. Benjamin Abelow lives on the East Coast in the United States. He holds the degree in history, and he also holds a medical degree. He writes, he lectures, and he lobbies, among other things, on nuclear arms policy to the Congress, the US Congress, that is. Benjamin, welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
When I found about out about your book, I was just struck. I mean, this is basically in a nutshell what we have been saying for the last year almost now about the war in Ukraine. We publish articles based on information largely coming from American voices, American alternative media. We have interviewed people like, for example, Noam Chomsky, the one and only, and we have cited before people that you also mentioned, like Jack Matlock, former ambassador to the former Soviet Union, John Mearsheimer, and others. And we just published a review of this book, Richard Sakwa, Frontline Ukraine, by one of our colleagues. Very interesting, which, by the way, was written before the war, but is as relevant during the war as before. Now,
Great.
before we go...
I'd love to see that review.
Well, it's in Dutch, of course, and you can put it through Google Translate. Before we got into the subject, let me emphasize something that really is dear to me. That's we do not share this. I mean, you may not be aware of that in the US, but we do not share this mainstream, I call it a meme, a cliche of the US that basically divides the country in two parts. On the one hand, the sensible people who say whatever is the government is saying or the establishment is saying. And on the other hand, these so-called deplorables who cannot spell moron correctly, with nothing in between, as if Europe is any better on that way. But it's something that's being done all the time. Now, my experience and the experience of my younger colleagues here, because I'm the oldest guy in the team here, comes from excellent American voices, American alternative media that are the best in the world, and from people like yourself. Now, what hit me when I read your book, and it really hit me, is that you managed to tell all in barely 62 pages, that's 62 without the footnotes. This book really needs to be translated into Dutch. And that's also the reason why we really want to talk to you. Now, getting into the subject of the war. Now, regardless of the promises that have been made or not been made, the eastern expansion of NATO is, and that's one of your points, is a major cause of the war. Now, disregarding this claim by Russia goes actually, as you say, against the core of US policy itself, ever since the Monroe Doctrine. Now, Russia or China, they're not holding naval exercises in the Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic or Pacific coast. And in fact, when I do mention that, for example, in debates, most of my counterparts say, what a ridiculous counter-argument. Well, one of the things that you say is this is relevant. Is this precisely the point that you are making?
Yes, thank you. First, I'm glad to be here. I think the Monroe Doctrine, let me just go back a step. In 1823, President Monroe made a speech, I believe it was the State of the Union address, that he put forward some ideas that later became known as the Monroe Doctrine, which has been interpreted in various ways. But the primary way it's been interpreted now is that no foreign power, no potentially hostile foreign power can place military forces really anywhere in the whole Western Hemisphere. And the point that's so relevant, I think, for what's been happening with Russia and Ukraine and NATO is that, you know, obviously this is an American doctrine. It doesn't apply directly to Russia, but the idea behind the doctrine is that where a potential opponent places military forces is vitally important. And that's the lesson to be learned. And that's the lesson, that's the whole foundation of the Monroe Doctrine. Yet when it's come to Russia, the United States really has disregarded this very same principle that it itself sees as extremely important. And then it makes fun of those people who say that this is an important concept. They call them, you know, dupes of the Kremlin, Putin's puppet, et cetera, et cetera. I think the key thing is to really understand that the US has this policy, whatever one thinks of it, it indicates that countries really do perceive the location of a potential military threat with respect to its own borders as very important. And as I said, the US has really made this claim, in essence, with respect to the entire Western Hemisphere. Yet the US and NATO seems to disregard that very same concern, even when it applies directly on Russia's border.
Absolutely. And yet that is the point that here in the media are completely either disregarded or taken as ridiculous, etc., etc. Now, second point, in March last year, only like 2 months within the war, Prime Minister Boris Johnson made a surprise visit to President Zelensky, stating very clearly he was not to sign a peace agreement that was being brokered by Turkey. And as we find out now, even the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, at that time, now in a recent interview says, well, actually, the US and the UK came in and said, no way we're going to have a peace agreement or whatever. We are going to continue this war. Now, why is it, according to you, that the fact, when I say NATO, actually, let's put it that way, it's in fact the US, United States, that's the way the things have evolved, refuses to engage in any kind of negotiation, is, for example, the will to exhaust Russia. Is that really the only motive? Because is it not only about bringing Europe back in line behind the US? I mean, this goes, for me, according to and others' voices here, this goes back to a decades-long fear in the US that Europe might turn eastward and concentrate on economic ties with Russia, China on the Eurasian continent.
Yeah, that's a good question. It contains a lot of ideas and a lot of information. And some of it's, frankly, I find very hard to sort out right now. It's certainly true that the US has been very concerned about a turn of Europe toward Russia, and in particular, a turn of Germany toward Russia. And this deals with the whole question of quote unquote Ostpolitik, which has been very foremost. And it's also directly related to the whole question of the gas pipelines, et cetera. So I think that's certainly part of the picture. Whether it's the dominant picture or not, I don't know. There may be some who can assess that better than I can. I see that as one piece of the picture. Another piece, as you pointed to, is this question of weakening Russia. It's very clear that one of the US objectives, and this became clear about a month, it became public about a month after the war started, but some people believed it was important right from the very beginning, is that the US has tried to use this war as a way to weaken Russia by exhausting its military forces. Some people have even hoped that it would so destabilize the Russian regime that Vladimir Putin might be replaced or overthrown in some way. And I think this is very important. And I think this is an important reason why the US has resisted a direction towards peace negotiations, really from the very beginning. As you said, there were negotiations, very active negotiations that took place in Turkey in March. I believe those were mostly towards the end of March. And then when Boris Johnson showed up in Ukraine and spoke with Zelensky, he made it clear that they should not continue with this. Now it's become clear that Naftali Bennett, who was then Israeli prime minister, had, and I think this may have been a separate set of negotiations. I'm not sure if they were in some way linked, This just became clear over this weekend on Saturday, so I'm not sure yet whether they were linked or whether this is a whole separate set of negotiations. But Naftali Bennett apparently traveled to Moscow, met with Putin, received a whole set of specific commitments, including that he would not try to kill Zelensky, et cetera, and there were other, or not overthrow the Zelensky government even. And there were a whole set of commitments that it seemed like Russia was willing to make, and it seemed like Zelensky might be on board with. But then the Western powers, again, seem to have broken that up. This was involved with the US, with Germany, France, and the UK. You know, whether they felt they needed to, quote unquote, punish Putin for this invasion, or whether there was also in the background an attempt to weaken Russia, I'm not clear on that yet. But it's certainly clear that there were multiple factors, and there may have also been more general geostrategic factors that the US wanted to, as we were saying before, wanted to, you know, number one, avoid some sort of consolidation of European powers with Russia, but also may have been attempting to maintain some of these ideas that go back decades about Central Asia being the heartland, going back to Brzezinski and others. So I think there may have been multiple factors involved. What is the single most important? And then, of course, one also has to throw in these questions of the broad background influence of the military-industrial complex, and how much of that tilts the entire playing field towards a direction of war and against policies that could lead to peace. So I think all of these factors come into play, and I, for one, find it very difficult at this point to sort out which is the single most important one.
Well, I can say that I absolutely agree with your point, saying that, well, I'm a bit older. I'm going to be 70 this year. When I talk to young people and they say, is there going to be a third world war? I always say, well, I don't know, but you have to be aware of the possibility and do whatever you can to avoid it. And one of the things that I always say, a war never starts for one reason only. It's always a complex issue. Well, if you read the mainstream media here, there's only one reason why it started, and that's this madman over there, which, by the way, only 10 years ago was a good guy, you know? But coming to another point of your book, there's so much to say, but one of the mainstream arguments is that, well, Ukraine is a sovereign country. They are free to decide what organizations they want to join or not join. Now, for your information and for your information of the American and foreign public, Belgium, my own little country here, I live here near Brussels, where NATO headquarters are located. Well, nobody, not even the Belgian government, ever asked the Belgian people their opinion in 1949, whether they wanted to join NATO or not. Secondly, we are one of 5 European countries that have US nuclear warheads, I mean warheads to be carried on planes, those kind. There's not even a treaty on this. In fact, this is the only issue where the Belgian government refuses to answer parliamentary questions. So they don't answer, are they there or they're not there, to tell you about sovereignty. And these bombs, by the way, fall under the exclusive US authority, not under the Belgian authority. Now, public opinion here is overwhelmingly against their presence, talking about sovereignty. Now, how do you respond to this claim that Ukraine should have the right to join NATO if they so wish to do?
Yeah, I think there are several points here. I think to start with, I think one has to distinguish between the right of a country to say that they want to join NATO versus the obligation of NATO to accept them as a country, as a member. So one has to remember, NATO, of course, is a military defense pact, and the decisions ultimately are made by the countries that are already a member of that pact to decide whether they feel that it enhances their own security, number one, and number two, whether it even enhances Ukraine's security. I think people sometimes make the mistake of thinking that if Ukraine says they want to join NATO, that this is necessarily the best thing for them. Now, the reality is, look what happened. it looked like Ukraine was trying to join NATO. The West refused to renounce Ukraine's acceptance into NATO, and then this war started. Now that does not this war has not increased NATO security. Yet, if NATO had refused to join NATO and to decline that, and the West had been stated explicitly that they would not accept Ukraine into NATO, my own sense is that this war never would have started. So this disaster that's now happening is a disaster for Ukraine because they were trying to join NATO and because the West refused to renounce that. So I think that's one distinction that has to be made. Number two, one also has to look at what's been going on. You know, I believe the U.S. has been using the whole NATO statement as a way perhaps to incite Russia and to draw them into a proxy war. Now, whether that's been a major factor or whether they're just some isolated influences in the U.S. government that have wanted that war is, again, very hard for me to say. But I think that one has to recognize that that the U.S. itself may have played a role in pushing Ukraine towards sticking with asserting some kind of desire to join NATO. Finally, I think that one also has to look at the question of what has been the role of the Ukrainian far right, you know, the neo-fascists, whatever one wants to call them, in pushing for NATO membership. I think one has to make a distinction between a desire within Ukraine to join the European Union, either as an actual member or just as an affiliate, and the desire to join NATO. Now, I think the far right has been pushing Ukraine very hard in certain directions. So if it were not for the threats of the far right, it's very hard to know exactly what the Ukrainian positions would be. I mean, keep in mind that Mr. Zelensky came into office in 2019. He won with over 70% of the vote, running on a peace platform. Now, within months of that, his life was threatened by the Ukrainian far right. And ultimately, he moved away from a platform of negotiations of peace in the Donbass. So what is actually the desire of the Ukrainian people, and what has actually been the desire of Mr. Zelensky, versus what has in some way been forced upon them by a small but violent minority within the country, is also a very important distinction that one needs to make. And here one needs to keep in mind statements by Stephen F. Cohn, a great late scholar from Princeton and NYU, that the U.S. really needed to state that they have Mr. Zelensky's back in helping him move forward with his peace platform, but they never did that. It seemed that the forces within the U.S. that were eager to create pressure on Russia by not having negotiated peace settlement in the Donbass may have been too strong, and that as a result, the U.S. did not back Zelensky in his peace objectives. We're talking about Minsk and Minsk II, of course. So, and then people like Jack Matlock, the previous U.S. ambassador to the USSR in 1987 to 1991, who actually helped negotiate the end of the Cold War with Mr. Gorbachev, he has stated that he believes that if Minsk has been able to go through, that this war never would have started. So I think that the very idea that Ukraine, that the U.S. has to accept NATO, the U.S. and NATO had to accept Ukraine as a member because Ukraine made public statements, is wrong in many respects, and is actually kind of used as a rhetorical device by people who wanted to bring Ukraine into NATO to sort of argue for it. So I think it's in some way a verbal trick that's been used to argue for a certain set of political positions that were very confrontational toward Russia.
Well, Ben, thank you very much for your availability and giving this some explanation on this little book. Just to cite Jack Matlock here, brilliant, remarkably concise explanation of the dangers that US and NATO military involvement in Ukraine has created. And then, of course, very well done, reviews material that should be much better known. Citation by Noam Chomsky. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank our followers. Please, if you like this video and other ones, don't forget to support us and to subscribe to our YouTube account. Thank you very much.